There's a picture of our garden center, and as I said, Cameron Brown's father helped change that into the company cafeteria to what it is. We try to have some fun. We have Stark Week, like Shark Week, and it's in July. And it's James Hart Stark's birthday is July 30th, and so we pick up the tail end of July, and we have Stark Week, and we have some fun with that. One of the people that made the company great was this gentleman who's known as the Wizard of Horticulture, and that's Luther Burbank. Now, to be honest with you, when I moved from Boston to St. Louis in September 2012, I did not know who Luther Burbank was. They teach about him in the Louisiana school systems. And you realize pretty quickly just how important he was in the whole scheme of things. He developed more than 800 strains of fruits and vegetables and flowers, and he was doing this in the 1890s. Now, why is that important? In the 1890s, there was no patent protection for what you did. So the Burbank russet potato, which is his, he didn't make a dime on. Right? Burbank, California is named after Luther Burbank, but he had all these things, and he wasn't making a living on doing it. So here's this brilliant guy. He's not making a dime on it. And he met, and we'll connect some dots here, but he met, I think, Clarence Stark at one of the trade show fairs that Stark Brothers would go on, and they started talking, and they said, you know what? We're going to pay you a decent living. We're going to pay you a pretty decent salary for this time if you come work for us. And all these things that you invent, that we've got the chance to sell them, distribute them, and then everybody wins and everybody makes money doing that. And so that came together through a collaboration of those two guys together. And his dying wish, he died in, I think, the early 20s. His dying wish was that Stark Brothers would get his assets. Now, the rumor was, literally until our history book was written, that he bequeathed all his stuff in his will, right? And they're writing the book, and the author calls me, she said, because it's on our website, right? So if it's on the internet, it must be true, right? I think Abraham Lincoln said that. It's on our website that he bequeathed it in his will, and Ken, it's not true. It's not true. And she did some research on it, and so what happened was there was an arrangement made with his wife, and Stark Brothers wrote a check for $27,000 for all those things. The canceled check is in the Smithsonian Institution, so there's our proof of that, which is kind of cool. And then it goes on. And his legacy is amazing. As again, I had never heard of the guy. This is a picture of Luther Burbank and Henry Ford and Thomas Edison as three stalwarts of industry, right? This guy that did his work in Louisiana, Missouri with us was kind of top of the charts there. There's a picture of a photo op from 1927 after the death for that $27,000. And then one of the things that we did, Paul Stark Sr. did, they said, hey, you know what? This Luther Burbank, this stalwart of American industry, it's kind of unfair that people can invent these things and just lose them immediately. And so they worked with actually the Governor LaGuardia of the state of New York to introduce legislation into the U.S. government and Congress to create this Patent Act. And the Patent Act was passed in 1930, and then in 1932 was the first one that Burbank had done for Stark Brothers. Fork in the road. We talked about the Stark Brothers, and we talked about times in our history, and we talked about surviving financial panics. And there was a financial panic in the late 1880s, and Stark couldn't make its payroll. And fork in the road, what's going to happen? And so one of the employees, his uncle was well-to-do, and he went to, Clarence Stark, and he said, I'll make a deal with you. I'll cover your payroll, and you can keep your company going and keep my nephew working. But I'd like to have some influence in what you do, and I think you need to be doing some marketing. Again, so we're at 1880s, we're talking marketing, when people didn't know what marketing was, really. And he said, what I think you need to do is I think you need to get your brand out there. Nobody knew what a brand was. I need to get your brand out there, and we need to find a way so that people find Stark and fruit synonymous with each other. And we'll start doing some things together along those lines. And one of the things they did was they would go to these harvest shows throughout the United States, and they'd set up a booth, and they would, much like this, right, but in the fall, and they would advertise ahead of time, if you've got some fruit that you think is unique and nowhere else, then bring it to us, and we'll see what we can do with that. And so and this is very early on. So in 1893, Jesse Hyatt, at an Iowa farm show, he submits this Hawkeye fruit, and there was so much fruit that came in that day, they couldn't do it all. They took it back to Louisiana. They're going through it, and Clarence Stark bites into this fruit. He says, "This is delicious, and that shall be its name." The problem is they don't know where they got it from. So they had to go back to Iowa the next year, and they had to find Jesse Hyatt, and they got his apple. And so the delicious apple came into play. Yes, sir? It says oddly shaped. Yeah, very good point. Sorry to yell. So it's got these 5 bumps on the bottom, right? It had nothing, and actually that's a good segue to another story. And by the way, the rumor is the 5 bumps are STARK, right? so it was kind of all God intended, right? So Jesse Hyatt, so that's 1893. 10, 15 years prior to that, and this was the Paul Harvey story, 10 to 15 years prior to that, Jesse Hyatt's on his farm in Iowa, and obviously people did farming all the time then. It was the largest profession then. And he gets this tree coming out of the ground that he just says, "What is this? It's a nuisance tree." And he chopped it down. And the next year it came back up, and he chopped it down, and it came back up, he chopped it down, and he kept doing that, and the tree kept going. And Jesse said, and these are Paul Harvey's words, "If God wants me to have this tree, I might as well have this tree." So he let the tree grow, and it needed 5 years before it fruited. And the year it fruited, he got 1 fruit. And it was that apple, not that apple. It was that apple. And he said, "Wow, this is pretty good." And he had heard the Stark brothers sing. And the next year, he got a full crop of apples, and he brought them through. And then the rest is history. And again, it took 15 years essentially to get this first piece of fruit. So it is oddly shaped. Interesting thing is that, so fast forward 20 years, and the Golden Delicious apple comes, and I've got some slides on that. But the real interesting thing is this. Today in the world, there will be 1 billion apples eaten. And 2/3 of those apples are cousins of those 2 apples. They're all crossbreeding and stuff like that. They're all, so most apples, a lot of apples, are cousins of those. So that's kind of neat. Good question, thank you. So let's talk about the golden apple. So same thing, fast forward, Stark Brothers is doing this marketing, and they get this case of fruit, a case of yellow fruit that gets sent to the offices. And it's Paul Stark Sr. He gets them, and he says, "Wow, this is incredible." So as I said, 1893, people didn't eat apples. The Red Delicious apple is kind of the first one that came along. This apple, that's all you could do with it, really. This was an eating apple. This is a connoisseur's apple. People talked about this apple the way they talk about wine, as far as spices and flavors emanating through it. And so he did, again, this is 1914. He can't fly to West Virginia where it came from. So he gets on, they take a train and horseback, and they get there, and he writes a check. They agree, he writes a check for $5,000, and they built this giant fence over it so that nobody could come and take the budwood. And that was, and of course, how do you have 2 delicious apples? So that became the Golden Delicious, and the Red Delicious became the Red Delicious at that point in time. That's a copy of the handwritten note that came. This is like on an Applebee's napkin, pun intended. And it's just handwritten note. He's crossed out and he's circling stuff. That's what came with it. We've got that framed and in our office, and it is kind of neat. In fact, Anderson Mullen's granddaughter, so we did a celebration in 2014 on the 100th anniversary of the Golden Delicious apple. His granddaughter called me up, and she started telling me stories and stuff like that. And again, kind of interesting piece of history for our company. And as I said, you can't have 2 delicious apples, so that's when the red and gold were set up.